Ken Turner stood at the window of his expansive home, gazing out at the misty Seattle skyline. His success as the owner of a thriving chain of luxury hotels gave him everything the world considered valuable: wealth, status, and influence. Yet, as the autumn rain drizzled against the glass, Ken's heart felt as barren as the house he lived in. At 50, he was adrift in a sea of solitude, having sacrificed personal happiness for professional success. His once promising marriage had ended in a bitter divorce, and his estranged relationship with his daughter, Emily, had left an irreparable void. The only person who kept him tethered to a sense of responsibility was his aging mother, Margaret, who battled severe arthritis and lived with him. The tension in the house often felt unbearable, the silence thick with unspoken regret. Margaret, now confined to her wheelchair, had become a shadow of the vibrant woman who had once run a community garden and filled their lives with love and laughter. Her condition worsened, her mind often clouded with confusion, and Ken struggled to keep up with her needs. One evening, feeling suffocated by the heaviness of the house, Ken decided to take a walk through the park that bordered his property. The cold air bit at his skin, but it was a relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. He wandered aimlessly, his mind heavy with thoughts of the past and regrets that wouldn't let him sleep. As he walked deeper into the park, the faint sound of crying reached his ears. He followed the sound until he came upon a small figure huddled beneath a large oak tree. It was a boy, no older than 8, shivering and sobbing quietly. Ken knelt beside him. "Hey, are you all right?" The boy looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. His clothes were torn, and his eyes held a fear that pierced through Ken's heart. "I'm lost," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to get home." Ken's heart softened, the emptiness inside him momentarily replaced by concern. "What's your name?" "Rob," the boy sniffled, wiping his face with a sleeve that was too thin for the cold night. "I don't have a home." "Not really." Ken's stomach clenched. He didn't know how to process the sudden rush of emotions, but he knew one thing: he couldn't leave the boy out here alone. "Rob, you can come home with me tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." Rob hesitated but then nodded, too tired and scared to argue. As they walked back to Ken's house, the boy revealed bits of his life, a life that Ken could barely fathom. Rob had been living in a makeshift shelter near the park for weeks, abandoned by a mother who had struggled with addiction and a father he had never known. The harshness of the boy's reality struck Ken deeply, echoing the loneliness he had tried to bury under layers of success. When they arrived home, Rob's wide eyes took in the size of the house. "Is this all yours?" he asked, all mingling with disbelief. Ken managed a small smile. "It is. And tonight, it's yours too." The next morning, Ken woke early, the events of the previous night still fresh in his mind. Rob had fallen asleep almost instantly after eating a warm meal, his exhaustion palpable. As Ken brewed coffee in the quiet of the kitchen, he found himself thinking about how different his life might have been if he had taken a different path, if he had put more effort into his relationships, particularly with his daughter, Emily. The sound of footsteps drew his attention. Rob stood at the kitchen entrance, his hair tousled and his face uncertain. "Good morning," Ken greeted with a warmth that surprised even him. Rob looked around nervously. Where am I?" "You're safe," Ken assured him. "I brought you here last night. Do you want some breakfast?" Rob nodded hesitantly, and Ken set about making pancakes, something he hadn't done in years. As they sat at the table, the boy's nervousness began to ease, and Ken could see a flicker of trust growing in his eyes. After breakfast, Ken said, "I want you to meet someone. My mom, Margaret." Rob's eyes widened. "Your mom lives here too?" Ken smiled. "She does. She loves gardening. I think you'll like her." An hour later, Ken wheeled Margaret out to the garden, where the autumn flowers still clung to life. Margaret, frail but sharp-eyed, watched Rob with curiosity. "And who is this young man?" she asked, her voice softened by age but still full of warmth. "This is Rob," Ken introduced. "I found him in the park last night. He's staying with us for now." Margaret's expression softened as she looked at the boy. "Rob, do you like flowers?" Rob nodded, his eyes drawn to the vibrant colors still in bloom. I guess. I never really saw a garden before." Margaret smiled and beckoned him closer. "Come here, I'll show you how to take care of them. The boy approached cautiously, and soon, under Margaret's patient guidance, he was learning how to water the plants and prune the overgrown bushes. The sight of his mother, who rarely showed interest in anything these days, engaging with Rob brought a rare sense of peace to Ken. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his house wasn't just a cavernous space filled with silence, it was a home. As the days passed, Rob and Margaret formed an unlikely bond. Margaret, whose mind often wandered due to her condition, seemed more lucid and engaged in Rob's presence. Ken watched from a distance, amazed at the way the boy's presence had brought life back into his mother. Ken couldn't shake the feeling that Rob's arrival was more than just a chance encounter. The boy had sparked something in him that he hadn't felt in years: responsibility, connection, even hope. He began to wonder if perhaps Rob could stay permanently. The idea both excited and terrified him. He had already failed once as a father. Could he really step into that role again? His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. When Ken opened the door, he found a woman standing there, her face etched with desperation. She was disheveled, her eyes hollow, and her hands trembling. "I'm looking for my son," she whispered, her voice cracked from years of hardship. "Is he here?" "His name is Rob." Ken's heart plummeted. This was Rob's mother, the woman who had abandoned him. How had she found him? More importantly, what did she want? The woman's name was Sarah, and as she stood in Ken's doorway, the truth began to spill out. She had fallen into a life of addiction, spiraling downward after losing her job and her home. Rob had been the last connection to her old life, but she hadn't been able to care for him properly. In her desperation, she had left him to fend for himself, thinking he'd be better off without her. But now, guilt had brought her back, and she wanted him returned. Ken's instinct was to slam the door in her face, to protect Rob from the pain of being taken back by a mother who had failed him. But before he could say anything, Rob appeared in the hallway, his face pale. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah took a shaky step forward. "Rob. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you like that." Ken felt torn, unsure of how to proceed. This was a critical moment for Rob, and Ken's role in his life was still undefined. He had begun to see Rob as his own son, but he had no legal claim to the boy. If Sarah wanted him back, what right did Ken have to stop her? Ken's mind raced as he watched the reunion unfold before his eyes. Sarah fell to her knees, reaching out to her son with trembling hands. Rob stood frozen, his emotions warring between relief and anger. "You left me," Rob said, his voice cracking. Rob's words cut through the tension like a blade, and Sarah flinched, her hands dropping to her sides. "I know," she whispered. "I did, and it was the worst mistake I've ever made. I'm trying to make it right." Ken stood back, struggling with his own feelings. A part of him wanted to believe Sarah's remorse, to believe that she was here to make amends. But another part, the part that had come to care for Rob as his own, felt protective. He had witnessed the quiet resilience Rob had built in the absence of his mother, and Ken couldn't help but wonder if Sarah's return would undo the progress the boy had made. Rob shifted uncomfortably. "Where have you been all this time? Why didn't you come back sooner?" Sarah wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I couldn't. I was so ashamed. I thought you'd be better off without me. I didn't want you to see how bad things had gotten." Silence settled between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken pain. Ken could see the turmoil in Rob's eyes, a boy torn between longing for his mother and the betrayal of being abandoned by her. Ken knelt beside Rob, keeping his voice calm. "You don't have to decide anything right now, Rob. You've been through a lot. Take your time." Rob looked up at Ken, eyes full of questions and uncertainty. "What if she leaves me again?" Ken's heart clenched. He wanted to say that wouldn't happen, but he couldn't make promises for someone else. Instead, he said, "Whatever happens, you'll always have a place here. I'll make sure of that." Sarah stepped forward cautiously. "I'm trying to get better, Rob. I've been going to meetings, and I have a place now. A small apartment. I want to take you with me, but only if you want to come." Ken knew that the choice ultimately lay with Rob. This was his life, his pain, and his decision to make. Rob glanced between the two adults, visibly struggling. I don't know," he said softly. I need to think. Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I'll come back in a few days. Just think about it, okay? With that, she left, the sound of the door closing behind her reverberating in the house like an echo of all the difficult choices that still loomed ahead. The days after Sarah's visit were tense. Rob retreated into himself, often wandering through the garden with Margaret, who seemed to sense his unease without needing to ask. Ken tried to give the boy space, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. What if Sarah came back and took Rob away? He had grown attached to the child more quickly than he ever imagined. The thought of losing him was unbearable. One afternoon, while Rob and Margaret were outside, Ken sat down with a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the adoption papers he had picked up a few days ago. He had already begun the process of inquiring about adopting Rob, assuming that Sarah had no intention of returning. But now, with Sarah back in the picture, everything was thrown into question. Legally, she still had rights to her son, and Ken wasn't sure what his role was anymore. His thoughts were interrupted when Margaret wheeled herself into the kitchen. She had become more mobile lately, thanks to Rob's help in the garden, and Ken marveled at how much her energy had returned since the boy's arrival. He's been good for you, hasn't he? Margaret said, as if reading his thoughts. Ken smiled faintly. He's been good for all of us. I just don't know what happens now. Margaret placed her hand on his. Her arthritic fingers trembled, but her grip was still strong. You care for him, Ken. That's all that matters. He'll know that. Ken sighed. But what if Sarah takes him away? What if she's really ready to be his mother again? Margaret's gaze softened. Then you'll have to trust that whatever happens is what's best for him. But don't give up on him just because his mother's come back. Love isn't about possession, it's about being there, no matter what. Ken nodded, though the uncertainty still weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the boy who had brought warmth back into his life. That evening, after dinner, Ken found Rob sitting by the window in his room, staring out into the night. Mind if I sit with you? Ken asked gently. Rob shrugged, his small frame looking even more fragile against the vastness of the room. Ken sat down beside him, unsure of what to say at first. I know you've got a lot to think about, he began. And whatever you decide, I'll support you. Rob was quiet for a moment before speaking. Do you think she's really changed? Ken considered the question carefully. I don't know, Rob. People can change, but it's hard to know for sure until they show you. Rob's voice was barely a whisper. I'm scared. What if she goes back to how she was before? I don't want to be alone again. Ken placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. You won't be alone. I promise you that. For the first time since Sarah's visit, Rob leaned into Ken, allowing himself to be comforted. In that moment, Ken realized just how much Rob had come to trust him, and the weight of that trust made him more determined than ever to protect the boy, no matter what. A week passed, and Ken found himself more anxious with each passing day. He knew Sarah would return soon, and Rob would have to make a decision. The thought of Rob leaving the house for good gnawed at Ken constantly, but he did his best to stay calm for the boy's sake. One evening, while they were having dinner, Rob finally spoke up. I want to stay here, he said quietly, almost as if testing the words. I don't think I'm ready to go with her. Ken looked up, trying to contain the relief that surged through him. Are you sure? It's a big decision. Rob nodded, though his expression was still conflicted. I don't know if she'll stay better. I love her, but I don't know if I can trust her yet. Ken's heart swelled with pride for the boy's bravery. Then you can stay here as long as you need to. I'll talk to her when she comes back. True to his word, when Sarah returned the following day, Ken met her at the door. He explained Rob's decision, bracing for the inevitable conflict. But to his surprise, Sarah simply nodded, tears filling her eyes. I understand, she whispered. He deserves to feel safe. I'll keep working on myself, and maybe one day, he'll want to come back to me. Ken admired her willingness to accept Rob's choice, though it didn't make the situation any less complicated. You'll always be welcome to visit him, Ken said, softening his tone. Sarah gave him a weak smile. Thank you. When Rob learned of the conversation, he seemed relieved, though Ken could still see the sadness in his eyes. He knew it wasn't easy for Rob to choose between his past and the new life he was building, but Ken felt confident that the boy had made the right choice for himself, at least for now. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Ken's household. Rob settled into his life with the Turners, growing more comfortable with each passing day. Margaret continued to bond with him, teaching him about gardening and sharing stories from her past, her mind sharper than it had been in years. The adoption process, while still in its early stages, began to move forward. Ken felt a renewed sense of purpose, pouring his energy into building a future for Rob, one where the boy could grow and heal from the scars of his past. The loneliness that had once haunted Ken's every waking moment was slowly replaced by a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. One afternoon, Ken received a call from his estranged daughter, Emily. It had been months since they had spoken, but word of the adoption had reached her. "I heard you're trying to adopt a boy," Emily said, her voice guarded. Ken's pulse quickened, unsure of how to respond. "I am," he admitted. "His name's Rob." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I think I'd like to meet him." Ken's heart leapt. It had been years since he and Emily had truly connected, and the possibility of rebuilding that bridge felt like a miracle in itself. "I'd like that, Em. I'd like that a lot." The day of the adoption finally arrived. Ken had organized a small celebration at the house, inviting a few close friends and family members. Margaret beamed with pride as she watched Rob, now officially a Turner, run around the garden she had taught him to care for. Emily arrived just before the ceremony began. Ken greeted her with a tentative smile, unsure of how she would react to meeting Rob. But when she saw the boy, her face softened, and she knelt down to introduce herself. "Hi, Rob. I'm Emily. I guess we're family now." Rob smiled shyly, nodding. "Nice to meet you." Ken stood back, watching the two most important people in his life connect for the first time. A profound sense of peace washed over him. The loneliness that had once defined his existence was gone, replaced by the warmth of a family he had never expected to have. As the sun set over the garden, Ken stood beside Rob, Margaret, and Emily, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The Turner family, once fractured and isolated, was whole again, united not by blood, but by love, trust, and the shared commitment to a better future. Ken looked down at Rob, whose eyes sparkled with the joy that had been absent when they first met. The boy had given Ken something more valuable than any business success ever could, a second chance at fatherhood, at family, and at happiness. "Welcome home, Rob," Ken whispered, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Rob smiled up at him, his face radiant with the warmth of belonging. "Thanks, Dad." And in that moment, Ken knew that this was only the beginning of a new and beautiful chapter in all of their lives. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.